Hi, I'm Brendan from SSW, and this is a short video on the use of CQRS within the SugarLearning solution. In a previous video, I ran through some of the problems as I see it in SugarLearning, and one of the key problems I had was how complicated the view models being used had become, because they were built from many classes with lots of inheritance, and that meant that the classes that then work with them to go and fetch data from the database and turn them into view models had to be very complicated with all kinds of generics and loading data in chunks across multiple files. So to clean that up, I'm advocating the use of CQRS. And in order to do that, we've got a brand new project within the SugarLearning application called ssw.sugarlearning.application. And this effectively replaces what's going on inside the business layer. So I've decided to bypass what's going on in the current logic classes and actually replace that with this new application layer. So one thing we're doing with this work is we're looking to migrate from MVC pages to Angular 6 pages. And with that, we're actually building a version 2 API, which means as we're building that API, we're building that API specifically for Angular as a web API, which means we're changing and restructuring our view models anyway. So here's the perfect opportunity to change those view models and then change how they're being loaded. So with the new CQRS based application, we've got this folder and we've got all these folders that basically break up functionality loosely by entity type. So let's take a look at item, because one thing we've implemented is one of the first things we've implemented is the edit item operation. And you see under item we've got a few folders. We've got commands. So commands are single operations that can change the state. They save things to the database. And queries don't change the state, they just load data from the database. So let's take a look at the query for get item for edit. And if I open that up, you can see we've got this class called get item for edit, and this class basically defines everything I need to build in order to raise this query against the system. So in fact, the things I need to send in are clearly defined in these constructor parameters. So in order to fire off the get item for edit query, I need an item ID and a company code. That's it. That's the definition. And then this definition overrides or implements this class called iRequests. That's a class from the mediator library, and the mediator library is what we're going to use to actually trigger the handlers for these particular queries. So to make this query happen, all I have to do is create one of these classes, feed it into mediator, and mediator will then go ahead and run something. And the thing it runs is a request handler. So there's a separation of concerns between creating the query and actually then running the query. And what runs the query is this request handler. And so what you can see here is this request handler is far simpler than any previous implementation, because it does one thing and one thing only. So we're replacing reusability with this single responsibility principle. But bearing in mind, this function itself is reusable. We can use it from many different places. We've decoupled it from the MVC layer, for example. Anything that's capable of building one of these objects and with access to mediator can fire this object into mediator, have mediator run this handler and give us that result. And the result it will give us is of type that edit item view model. If we take a look at our new view model, you can see that it's much cleaner than the previous view models. It is literally just a list of all the fields we need for editing that item. So if I now look at this get item for edit class, you can see we go to the repository, and in the previous versions we would load an item as an entire entity and then copy values to and from the loaded entity into the view model. But what we're doing here is slightly differently. Because our repositories have a get feature that returns an iQueryable, we can call select on that iQueryable and actually pass the fields we want directly into the query. So we're no longer loading an item as an entity and then tracking changes on that item. We are actually selecting directly into the view model, which means when we fire this query into the database, we're only going to retrieve the exact fields we want from the database in a select statement. We're not going to track changes on that entity. We're not going to load the entity as a whole thing. We're just going to fire the query and turn that query straight into a view model and return that view model back. So that's seriously cut down the amount of work being done by the database. So it's simple and quicker. So let's move on from there and take a look at the command, because that's a bit more involved. And in fact, one thing I'm going to advocate for on read operations is to do away with repositories completely and just load it directly from the database, because as per my previous video, there's far too much logic in the repositories and that's a code smell. When we come to the commands, we've got the save item and we've also got a validator, but I'll cover that in a different video. But if I then look at the save item edit, what I need to do to raise a save item command is I need to pass in my view model, the user that's making the change, and a few extra details. But once again, anything that can build this save item object and then pass it through to the mediator system, that then works. Now what I found is the save operation is a little bit more complicated because of the amount of logic that's being implemented in the repository layer. So I don't think any logic, certainly business logic, belongs in the repository layer, but unfortunately we've got the situation where there's a lot of business logic currently in the repository layer, and refactoring that out is too difficult for right now. So what we've done is basically ripped out the features from the old logic layer and re-implemented it here and cleaned it up as much as possible, but we're still passing through, we're still handling event handlers, for example, and we're still using the repository because that's doing things like tracking history changes and all those kind of things. So we've still got that code there, but we have still completely bypassed the old logic layer. And once again, this is much cleaner. This is a single operation for saving, and it acts on that single view model specifically made for editing. How do we then go ahead and use that inside our controllers? If I go into my web UI here and I take a look at for MVC v2 and look at my items controller, what you should see is far less logic and far less code going on in the controller classes, because now what the job of the controller classes is simply to receive requests from the network, turn them into a command or a query, and then execute that command or query against mediator. So where we had this logic that was scattered all over the place in the previous implementation, we had logic in the controllers, we had logic in the business layer, and we had logic inside the repositories. We've managed to clean that up and have as much as possible just logic inside those command handlers for those commands and queries, and clear separation of concerns. Now we still have issues where there's too much logic in the repositories, but this is a great step to help clean up this code base. And certainly now, because we're using the single responsibility principle, it's very easy to follow the path from here's the request coming in, here's the definition of the handler. If I F12 on this, I go straight to the definition of that query, and by convention we place the handler in the same class, so it's really easy to discover the full code for performing that work. And so we've turned something that was many classes into 2 classes, and it's all readable in one place. So I find that much easier to follow. Thank you for watching.